What's good? Welcome back to another video. The Miami Dolphins have officially hired Vic Fangio as their defensive coordinator. I guess it's not official, it'll become official after the Super Bowl because he is currently serving as a defensive consultant for the Philadelphia Eagles. But we don't need to rehash that whole saga where we thought we had him, then we didn't know for sure. But now that's all out of the way. After the Super Bowl, it will become official that Vic Fangio is the Miami Dolphins defensive coordinator. And with this hire, Vic Fangio as the defensive coordinator, I genuinely believe the Miami Dolphins have become legitimate Super Bowl contenders. Now, before we dive into how Vic Fangio elevates us into that upper echelon, it's important to understand how we got here into the position of hiring Mr. Fangio. And that was Josh Boyer being fired.
All right, Adam, more coaching news as we go to Miami. What can you tell us there?
Busy day. The Miami Dolphins fired their defensive coordinator, Josh Boyer, one of 4 coaches that they let go on the defensive side of the football today.
And to truly understand that decision, we have to go all the way back from when not Mike McDaniel was hired, but all the way back to February 4th, 2019, when the Miami Dolphins hired Brian Flores.
And I'm very excited to introduce Brian Flores as the next head coach of the Miami Dolphins. Thank you. It's been a whirlwind 24 hours.
That was the day after the New England Patriots had just won their 6th Super Bowl, and the Dolphins decided to hire New England Patriots defensive assistant and defensive play caller Brian Flores. When Flores was hired, he brought over some of his guys from that Patriots coaching staff, and that included cornerbacks coach Josh Boyer, who became the Miami Dolphins defensive coordinator in 2020. 2 years passed, and after 2 relatively successful seasons, defensively speaking, Brian Flores was fired and Mike McDaniel, as we all know, was hired as head coach. This is where it gets interesting because Mike McDaniel, being an offensively minded head coach, it was up in the air what would happen with the defensive side of the ball. And thanks to Jeff Darlington on Twitter, we now know the specifics of what happened last offseason with the defensive coordinator position. So, according to Jeff Darlington, Mike McDaniel was willing to bring Fangio to Miami last season when he was initially hired, but he had an understanding that Miami liked where they stood on the defensive side of the ball. And after having a good defensive season the previous year, it didn't not make sense to bring back Josh Boyer and run it back with almost the exact same personnel. It's important to mention that it wasn't a forced decision on McDaniel, it was just a decision that was made, and honestly, I can't blame them for that decision. But with that in mind, hindsight is 2020, and we all know what happened during this past season. While there were some external factors, like the crazy amount of injuries that the Dolphins faced, and in particular, the Dolphins secondary faced, the likes of Byron Jones, Brandon Jones, Nick Needham, Trill Williams, and more, the regression was just too significant for no change to be made. Not to mention, when you watch back the tape, there were times where personnel was not the issue, even with the injuries. It was the scheme and system which ultimately proved to be the most prominent headache. And with that, Josh Boyer was fired as defensive coordinator, as well as a number of positional coaches on the defensive side of the ball. Mike McDaniel, Chris Greer, and company were then tasked with filling that position and interviewed the following candidates: Vic Fangio, Sean Desai, a Vic Fangio disciple, and a young and upcoming promising young mind from Seattle; Chris Richard, a co-defensive coordinator with the Saints; and an internal candidate, Anthony Campanile, which is our linebackers coach. In the end, the Miami Dolphins landed the belle of the ball, the biggest name in this cycle for the defensive coordinator position in Vic Fangio. But why is he the belle of the ball? Why is he so revered? And why was he so demanded from so many different teams? That's why we're here. Who is Vic Fangio, and how does he make this Miami Dolphins team Super Bowl contenders? Vic Fangio is a 64-year-old defensive mastermind who has been coaching in the NFL since 1986 when he was the linebackers coach for the New Orleans Saints, which happened to be one of the best linebacker groups of all time. In 1995, he joined the Carolina Panthers as the defensive coordinator and helped lead them to an NFC Championship game. From 1999 through 2009, he coached with the Colts, the Texans, and the Ravens. That Ravens team featured a pretty good linebacker by the name of Ray Lewis, but you probably don't know who that is. After that, in 2010, he was the defensive coordinator for Jim Harbaugh in college, and followed him to the NFL in that same role when Harbaugh was hired as the 49ers head coach. Together, they turned around the 49ers defense, producing the most turnovers in the NFL in 2011. And from 2011 through 2014, he consistently produced elite defenses in San Francisco, having his defense never rank lower than 3rd. In 2015, he was released, but that's just because head coach Jim Harbaugh was fired, but he landed on his feet and became the Chicago Bears defensive coordinator. Over the next 3 years, his defense would rank 14th, 15th, and 10th, which doesn't seem that impressive until you realize the defense he had took on was ranked 30th the year prior to when he was hired. In 2018, the Chicago Bears hired a new head coach in Matt Nagy, but Fangio was retained as defensive coordinator and was granted complete control of the defense. And in that first year, with complete control of the defense, the Chicago Bears ranked number 1 in defense, jumping from 8th the prior year. They allowed the least amount of points, the 3rd least total yards, 7th least in passing, 1st least in rushing, while producing the most turnovers in the entire NFL. Just an utterly ridiculous year from that defense. Those numbers are insane. And after that, in 2019, he was well-deservingly hired as the new Denver Broncos head coach. And how did his defense perform there? Well, there was a drop-off in defensive personnel going from the Bears to the Broncos, yet because of his system and scheme, he had the Denver Broncos ranked 10th in his first year there, 10th in points against, 12th in total yards allowed, 11th in passing, 16th in rushing, while producing the 10th most amount of turnovers in the league. Oh, and by the way, their offense ranked 28th, so they weren't getting any help from the offensive side of the ball, which makes it that much more notable. In 2020, I'll be honest, it was a wash. He lost his best defensive player in Von Miller for the entire season, and the team struggled during this COVID-plagued year. For context, this was the year where an undrafted wide receiver started a game at quarterback for the Broncos, which kind of says everything you need to know. In 2021, his defense unsurprisingly returned to form, even with another horrid offense that ranked bottom 10 in the NFL. His defense, on the other hand, ranked 3rd in points allowed, 8th in total yards allowed, 8th in passing yards allowed, 15th in rushing yards allowed, which is even more impressive considering how unluckily they produced the 24th amount of turnovers that year. He was let go after that year and didn't plan on coaching this past season, but he did decide to act as a defensive consultant to the Philadelphia Eagles. Are they doing anything memorable or noteworthy this year? The Eagles, by the way, if you were wondering, allowed the 8th least points in the league this year and ranked 3rd in yards allowed, ranking 1st in pass yards allowed, so take that for what it's worth. So the defensive numbers he has put up over the course of his career speaks for themselves. It shows what quality of a coach you're getting in Vic Fangio. And while numbers don't lie, usually tape doesn't lie either. So how does Vic Fangio shut down opposing offenses so effectively, so consistently? Well, it all begins with a philosophical change to his defenses that Vic Fangio pioneered and created himself, which has also influenced so many different defenses in the league today. For example, Brandon Staley was a linebackers coach for Vic Fangio in Chicago and in Denver, and then he was hired as defensive coordinator for the Los Angeles Rams, and during that year, they produced the number 1 offense in weighted DVOA. Before we fully dive into breaking down the film and the scheme that Fangio uses, I do want to quickly shout out Ted Nguyen. I hope I pronounced his name correctly, but I do want to credit Ted because a lot of what I'm telling you is based on an article that he published for The Athletic where he did a deep dive into Vic Fangio's system, which helped me to better understand all the different principles and mechanics used within the scheme. A link to the article is in the description as well as his Twitter handle, so make sure you check those out. The first important trait of a Vic Fangio defense is 2 high safeties or 2 deep safeties to limit explosive plays and force quarterbacks to make reads and throw short. With those 2 high safeties pre-snap, before the snap, the defense shows the same cover 4 or quarter shell, which means he's showing 4 deep man-to-man principal defense before the snap, making it harder for quarterbacks to diagnose pre-snap. So quarterbacks need to do it after the snap and during the play, but even after the snap, it's kind of hard to gauge what the defense is doing because of that setup. Post-snap, Vic Fangio's base coverage is cover 6, which is a combination of cover 4 to the strong side and cover 2 on the weak side. That's not always the case. They will sometimes use cover 4 on the weak side as well, but that's usually the base coverage. Essentially what it does is that it puts an inane amount of pressure on quarterbacks to make reads after the snap because of how similar everything looks before the snap. For example, because of its 2 high structure, the defense has the ability to go into an array of different defenses, zone or man. They'll rotate from that initial cover 4 look pre-snap to cover 3, but it all looks the same. For example, here against the Chiefs, where by the way, the Fangio-led defense held Mahomes and company to just 267 total yards of offense. As you can see, they're lined up in their cover 4 quarter shell, and they try and remain that way up until the snap. As you can see, they are remaining in that cover 4 pre-snap shell look until the snap. And as you can see at the top of your screen on the 30-yard line, Justin Simmons, number 31, as the ball is snapped, then rotates down to cover his flat and cover Tyreek Hill. That leaves the other safety, number 22, to be the 1 deep safety, and they rotate into a cover 1 defense, which results in an incompletion for Patrick Mahomes. The other main attribute of a Vic Fangio defense is using light boxes so you can do more in the coverage game. Obviously, if you're using 2 high safeties instead of 1 high safety, you have to bring someone out of the box. Now, because of that, there is a trade-off instead of stopping the run, you're just trying to restrain it because it's so much harder with lighter boxes, which makes sense in a league where explosive passing is a major pain point for a defense. In that same play, you can see how the Broncos line up with just 5 men in the box initially, but it ends up being 6 when the tight end motions over, and number 41 Kenny Young follows him inside. And then right at the end, Fangio brings pressure from a defensive back as well. The principle here in the run game and for the defensive fronts is to force ball carriers to be more horizontal runners and allow for the secondary to come up and make tackles as runners go outside, essentially just ensuring that the ball carrier doesn't get too vertical too quickly. On this play, the Chiefs are lined up in a 3-by-1 formation, and as you can see, the Denver Broncos are still lined up in that 2 deep safety formation, and they try and remain that way for the duration of the pre-snap process. In this case, it does actually end up being a run, and you can see their principles in play where they try and keep Clyde Edwards-Helaire running horizontally and not let him get vertical, and that results in a only 2-yard gain. And you can also see the defensive backs get involved in the run game. As you see, it is an outside zone play for the Kansas City Chiefs. Clyde Edwards-Helaire is running and he's trying to find a hole, but as you can see, number 21, the cornerback, makes a play on the ball carrier in Clyde Edwards-Helaire and forces a stop. So that is just an example of what I was talking about when we discussed this team's kind of run defense. Because you have more resource allocation towards the pass coverage, you do need your secondary and your cornerbacks to be able to make tackles, as your defenders are forcing ball carriers to the outside and running horizontally, which allows for safeties and corners to make plays in the run game. Safeties play a major role in this defense because of how much they do, and we've already talked about their purpose in pass coverage, but what about the run game? Well, take this play against the Jets. Justin Simmons starts in that 2 deep safety position until the snap where he moves towards the line of scrimmage, and the Jets run an outside toss, and number 58 as the edge defender sets the edge and forces Michael Carter back inside. The other defensive linemen take their blocks, which lets Justin Simmons meet the ball carrier in the gap and make the stop. So it's a game of getting pressure organically with those light boxes while still being able to defend the run effectively to then allow more resource allocation to coverage. Obviously, if an offense comes out with a heavier set, Fangio will get another defender in the box, but the principles remain the same, showing cover 4 pre-snap and then rolling into a variety of zone or man coverages, which is hard for the opposing quarterback to deduce. In terms of formation, Fangio uses a 3-4 base, which won't stray too far from our personnel that we have, even though we base out nickel with the previous regime. The 3-4 base allows for 3 defensive linemen with their hand in the dirt to be primary rush stoppers, 2 edge rushers to be standing up, and then 2 off-the-ball linebackers to control that middle of the field. So the biggest change from the previous coaching staff and their system to this will be from single high to 2 high. So single safety covering deep to 2 deep safeties, because Josh Boyer would usually use 1 safety deep in coverage most of the time, which, by the way, put an insane amount of stress on cornerbacks to shadow wide receivers one-on-one with no help. In contrast, Vic Fangio's defense uses 2 deep safeties, and the responsibility of coverage is shared with the 2nd and 3rd levels. Shout out to Arjun Menon on Twitter. You can actually see on this chart where the Dolphins rank in 2 deep safeties in the NFL over the past few years, compared to teams where the Fangio defense is being used, like at Donatello, Minnesota, and Brandon Staley in LA. The last major trait or attribute of a Vic Fangio defense is not blitzing much and relying on your front 4 to organically pressure quarterbacks. That's what we're talking about with the light boxes and getting pressure organically, because you're not rushing too many people, and for example, you're not blitzing too many people either, because in 2019, the Broncos ranked 23rd in blitz percentage, and that number was around the same for his elite defenses in Chicago. So he's not much of a blitzer. He wants to get pressure organically with those front 3 and those 2 edge rushers, and then let his defensive pass game go to work. So what does this mean from a personnel standpoint, and how does this affect Miami's current core defensive pieces in terms of fitting in with this new scheme and system? Well, it's clear you need 2 coverage safeties. Javon Holland will continue to thrive and probably be better, and the defense will most likely be built around him, similar to the way Justin Simmons was used by Fangio in Denver. By the way, Justin Simmons, while he probably still is, was definitely a top 3 safety in the NFL with Fangio at the helm at that point in time. The safeties need to be athletic, and they need to be able to cover as well as make tackles because they're used so heavily. They're used to help make tackles in the run game, but they still have to have the athleticism to be able to cover deep. You'll also need run-stuffing interior linemen for that front three, which serves well for Miami when you remember that we might have the best run-stuffing defensive lineman in the NFL in Christian Wilkins, who ranked #1 in rush stop win rate. He also broke records for tackles and all that other stuff. We know how good Christian Wilkins is, so he will be a premium piece in this scheme. Not to mention one of the most, if not the most underrated player in the entire league, Zach Sealer, who is a prominent run stuffer in his own right. There are a few other key players who are so necessary for this scheme to work, but there are also a few players who could be on their way out, or at least might not be as much of a fit for this scheme. Jalen Phillips and Bradley Chubb will be major contributors in this system. Their ability to set the edge will be huge in the run game, especially considering the leg boxes that Fangio likes to use, and when it comes to getting pressure organically, because they ranked 4th and 7th respectively in pass rush win rate this year. Those guys will be tremendously important in terms of winning their one-on-one battles and getting to the quarterback and creating pressure without bringing extra blitzers. So when it comes to the defensive front, that front four, that front three, those front three and those 2 edge rushers, we are set. We are ready to go. Other than some changes with the depth at some of those positions, they're ready to rumble. The second level, though, as we all know, needs to be overhauled. Other than rookie Channing Tindall, who could thrive in the system because of his speed and his instincts, almost every other backer is at risk of not being on the team next year. A number of them have contracts expiring, like Atlanta Roberts, Duke Riley, and Sam Egovon, and Jerome Baker's contract can be released after June 1st for a savings of around $6 million. When it comes to the secondary and specifically the safety position, we already touched on Javon Holland, who will be a major part of this defense. But when it comes to safety partner Brandon Jones, I do think a third safety will need to be brought in. Not because of Brandon Jones, because he is utterly fantastic at what he does. He's massively underrated and has been a huge part of this defense over the past couple of years. But he's more of an inside-the-box safety who can blitz from the secondary. This scheme requires a more coverage-oriented safety, but that's not to say that he will be moved, because I still think he can be used to his strengths from the safety position. I'm just thinking more of a robber type of role and a pseudo linebacker in instances. But a third safety needs to be brought in to play that coverage role, and a third safety was probably necessary anyways, considering Eric Rowe's probable departure and with a lack of depth at this position. And finally, we get to the cornerback position, which isn't nearly as relied upon to do as many things as the previous system required. You still need players to be able to read and react to defenses and be able to adjust on the fly, which personally to me is just another sign that Byron Jones might be gone. He was already linked in trade rumors last offseason. That's when he decided to get surgery for an injury, which we didn't know the recovery would last the entire year, and it's just not a fit. And considering the cap savings you would get after June 1st by releasing him, it just makes sense. You could keep him and you would probably do fine, but I'm just not sure he'd be as comfortable in this scheme as he would be in more man-to-man oriented defenses. So when it comes to the salary cap and what you get for cutting him, especially considering the cap predicament that we're in right now, it kind of just makes sense. On the other hand though, man oh man am I excited to see Xavier Howard in this defense. I'd expect a major return to form from X with Fangio at the helm. This defense will allow Xavier Howard to use his ball skills, acceleration, and his ability to key offenses and read and react to the ball. Not to mention he won't be forced to play man-to-man on an island with no help anymore, covering the greatest receivers in the NFL. And that is so huge because Xavier Howard is a major core piece of this defense, and a majority of the core pieces, like I mentioned, have a place in this system. And we should be able to fill a couple of the holes during this offseason, which is why I believe this makes us legitimate Super Bowl contenders. As long as the offense remains elite, which it should with Mike McDaniel, Tua Tagovailoa, Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, Ron Armstead, you're bringing in a couple offensive linemen and you should be good to go. The defense should take a significant step up going from Josh Boyer to Vic Fangio, which is a recipe for success and a recipe for a ring. I'll leave you with this. When Sean McVay, Kyle Shanahan, and Matt LaFleur were all asked which coach's defense was the most hard to read and attack, every single one of them answered with the same name: Vic Fangio. Please leave in the comments your thoughts on the hire, what we should do with our personnel, and if this does make us Super Bowl contenders. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Vic Fangio is a Miami Dolphin.